Welcome back to the Ghastly Journal, where we uncover the darkest stories hidden in the shadows. Tonight's tale concerns a particular clause that appears in every rental agreement at the Thornfield Apartments, a stipulation so peculiar yet so stringently enforced that it has become something of an urban legend among residents of Millfield. The Thornfield stands as a testament to 1920s architecture. Its facade of weathered brick and ornate cornices, suggesting a dignity that has somewhat faded with the decades. 6 stories of apartments rise above Hemlock Street, where gaslight-inspired lamps cast pools of amber illumination across Rain's cobblestones in the evenings. The foyer retains its original marble flooring, though now veined with cracks that spider outward like frozen lightning. A brass elevator cage, meticulously maintained despite its antiquity, ascends through the building's heart, with mechanical protests that echo throughout the narrow corridors. New tenants invariably remark upon the building's peculiar atmosphere. A certain heaviness to the air, perhaps, or the way sound seems to travel differently within its walls. Conversations held in normal tones might be inaudible mere feet away. While whispers from distant corners occasionally reach ears with unsettling clarity, the scent of sandalwood and something less definable, something old, permeates the common areas, regardless of how frequently the windows are open to admit fresh air. Ella Laner Pembroke has served as property manager for 3 decades now. Her silver-streaked hair always arranged in an immaculate shiny. Her posture rigidly proper as she conducts interviews with prospective tenants in her ground-floor office. Age has rendered her face a map of fine lines. Yet her eyes remain sharp as she reviews applications with meticulous attention. The Thornfield offers comfortable accommodations at reasonable rates. She invariably begins, voice crisp as autumn leaves. We have a community of respectful tenants who value their privacy and the building's historical character. Our rules are few but absolute. It is at this juncture that Mrs. Pembroke leans forward slightly, her gaze intensifying as she slides across the wooden desk, a standard lease agreement, distinguished only by a paragraph outlined in red on the final page. You'll notice our special provision regarding the 3rd floor, she continues, tapping one slender finger against the crimson boundary. It bears emphasizing verbally, though it is clearly stated in writing. Under no circumstances are residents to enter the 3rd floor. Not for curiosity's sake, not if you hear unusual sounds, not even in case of perceived emergency. The 3rd floor remains permanently closed to all tenants without exception. When inevitably asked why Mrs. Pembroke's expression never changes. Historical preservation, she replies. The words practiced in hollow structural concerns. Sometimes building code restrictions. The explanation varies, but the rule remains inviolable. Most peculiar perhaps is the elevator's operation. Though, clear's throat, the brass indicator panel displays buttons for all 6 floors, pressing 3 results in nothing. The mechanism simply bypasses that level entirely, rising smoothly from 2 to 4 without pause or acknowledgement of the floor between. The stairwells, meanwhile, are interrupted by locked doors with no handles on the tenant side, bearing signs that read simply, "No access, management only." What lies behind those barriers remains the Thornfield's most persistent mystery, whispered about by residents who notice certain oddities as the months pass. Curious tenants have noted that despite the 3rd floor's alleged closure, mail is occasionally delivered there. The building's ancient pneumatic message system, a relic from when the Thornfield first opened its doors in 1923, sometimes carries the distinctive sound of a message capsule, whooshing toward the forbidden level. The elderly postman, Mr. Grayson, who has delivered to the building for over 40 years, deflects questions with practiced ease when residents inquire about packages or letters intended for the mysterious floor. Been told not to discuss building matters, he mumbles, arthritic fingers, sorting envelopes with surprising dexterity. Management policy, you understand. Yet observant residents have spotted him entering the stairwell with parcels wrapped in brown paper, returning empty-handed some 15 minutes later, his complexion notably paler, a fine sheen of perspiration on his brow regardless of the season. The Thornfield's maintenance records, available in the municipal archives to those determined enough to search, contain curious omissions. While detailed documentation exists for renovations to the lobby in 1936, the installation of radiator heating in 1942 and electrical upgrades throughout the 1970s. There exists no record of any work ever being performed on the 3rd floor. The building's original blueprints preserved in the Historical Society's collection show the 3rd floor containing 12 apartments with a layout identical to floors 2 and 4. Yet, a revised architectural drawing from 1931 suddenly depicts that level as simply private storage. Winter months bring peculiar phenomena that few residents openly discuss. When temperature inversions trap fog against the Thornfield's facade, the windows of the fourth floor and above gleam with warm lamplight, while those on the first and second floors display the blue glow of modern televisions and computer screens, but the third floor remains uniformly dark except on certain nights. The winter solstice, the equinoxes, and curiously, April 7th, when faint amber illumination can be glimpsed through the perpetually drawn curtains accompanied by shadows that move in ways suggesting neither modern appliances nor contemporary human activity. Most disturbing are the sounds. Residents on the second floor report ceiling creaks that might be dismissed as settling in any other building. Those on the fourth floor occasionally mention muffled conversations drifting up through their floorboards, never quite intelligible, yet carrying tonal qualities that leave listeners uneasy. The sounds intensify during thunderstorms, as though electrical disturbances somehow amplify whatever transpires on the sealed floor. Mrs. Kensington in apartment 5B, who has resided at the Thornfield since 1968, speaks in whispers about the time her granddaughter's ball bounced down the stairwell and came to rest against the third floor door. The child was reaching for it when something pushed it back from the other side. She confides over tea, her voice dropping further. Not rolled, pushed as though someone was returning it. Except the space beneath that door has been sealed with lead. Newcomers to the Thornfield are never told why April 7th holds significance. Marcus Whitaker, 26 years old and recently divorced, moved into apartment 2C last autumn with little more than a suitcase of clothes and the fractured remains of his former life. Slender to the point of gauntness, with perpetually ink-stained fingers betraying his profession as an illustrator, Marcus possesses the distracted air of someone whose mind constantly dwells in realms beyond the physical. I selected the Thornfield precisely for its atmosphere, he confessed to Mrs. Pembroke during his application interview. Gray eyes alike with the particular fervor of artists who find beauty in decay. Something about its presence speaks to me. Mrs. Pembroke had regarded him with that evaluating gaze she reserved for tenants she suspected might prove troublesome, her lips compressed into a bloodless line. Yet his impeccable credit and profession that allowed him to work silently at home eventually secured her approval. What Marcus failed to disclose was his lifelong sensitivity to impressions others couldn't perceive, a trait his pragmatic ex-wife had derided as pathological imagination during their dissolution proceedings. Within 3 days of occupancy, he began experiencing vivid dreams featuring the stairwell leading up to the forbidden third floor, its door standing inexplicably ajar. The dreams are remarkably consistent, he recorded in his leather-bound journal. I ascend the stairs drawn by music that sounds as though it's being played on a gramophone, scratchy and distant, yet compelling. A waltz, perhaps Strauss, though distorted somehow. The door stands open just enough to reveal a sliver of golden light, and I feel welcome despite the building's explicit prohibition. By his second month in residence, Marcus had begun positioning himself in the lobby during mail deliveries, sketchbook in hand, ostensibly drawing the ornate ceiling medallions while surreptitiously observing Mr. Grayson's movements. The elderly postman's routine never varied. After distributing letters to the accessible floors, he would retrieve a single brass key from within his postal bag, unlock the stairwell door, and disappear for precisely 12 minutes before returning visibly affected. On the 13th of February, Marcus followed at a discreet distance. The stairwell door, he discovered, did not immediately lock upon closing. Slipping through seconds after the postman, Marcus climbed silently behind him, maintaining a full flight's distance. He watched as Mr. Grayson unlocked the third-floor entrance with hands that trembled not from age but from what appeared to be profound apprehension. The door opened inward, admitting the postman, while affording Marcus the briefest glimpse of a corridor illuminated by wall sconces that flickered with actual flame rather than electricity. The floor was covered with a runner of deep burgundy, its pattern reminiscent of designs fashionable in the 1920s. Most striking was the scent that wafted from the opening. Sandalwood predominant, but beneath it something Marcus recognized instantly from his restoration work on antique books. The distinctive odor of vellum pages made from calf skin, preservative chemicals used in early taxidermy, and the unmistakable metallic tang of oxidizing iron. The door closed before Marcus could observe more. But that night, his dream shifted. No longer did they feature music and golden light. Instead, he found himself seated at a long table with 11 vacant chairs, a 12th occupied by a figure whose features remained obscured by shadow despite the candelabra burning directly before them. "We've been expecting you," the figure said, voice neither masculine nor feminine, but somehow both simultaneously. April 7th approaches. The circle requires completion. Marcus found himself increasingly drawn to his sketchbook in the weeks following his glimpse beyond the forbidden door. His illustrations, once precise and deliberate, now emerged in feverish sessions that left him drained yet strangely exhilarated. The drawings all featured variations of the same subject, 11 figures seated around a table, their features indistinct, save for their eyes, which he rendered with unsettling precision. The 12th chair always remained empty, positioned directly across from a shadowed entity whose proportions seemed to shift subtly between sketches. His apartment walls soon displayed dozens of these compositions, their collective presence transforming his living space into something akin to a shrine. Visitors, the few he still permitted, invariably commented on the disking sensation of being observed from every angle within the room. "They're waiting," he explained to Mrs. Finch from apartment 2A when she delivered a misplaced package. "Every night they become more insistent." The elderly woman had retreated with uncharacteristic haste, the tapping of her orthopedic shoes echoing down the corridor like anxious Morse code. Sleep became a treacherous landscape for Marcus. The dreams intensified, acquiring tactile elements that lingered upon waking. The texture of the wooden chair beneath his fingertips, the weight of ceremonial robes upon his shoulders, the distinctive aroma of beeswax candles mingled with something ferric and vital. Most disturbing was the increasing clarity with which he could now perceive his 11 tablemates, their faces gradually revealing themselves as the April date approached. He recognized them all. Each was a current Thornfield resident. Mrs. Pembroke, her silver-streaked shiny immaculate even in this dreamscape. Mr. Landry from 6F with his distinctive scar bisecting one eyebrow. The reclusive twins from apartment 4C, their synchronous movements even more pronounced around the table. 8 others, all familiar from lobby encounters or glimpsed through partially open doors. The shadowed host, however, remained obstinately obscured, though its voice grew clearer with each nocturnal gathering. The pattern must be maintained. It insisted on the night of April 1st. One departs, another arrives. The equilibrium sustains us all. Upon waking, Marcus discovered a formal invitation slipped beneath his door. The cardstock heavy and cream-colored, its edges adorned with an intricate pattern that matched precisely the burgundy runner he'd glimpsed in the third-floor corridor. The elegant calligraphy read simply, "Your presence is required. April 7th, 8 o'clock evening, 3rd floor. The Thornfield formal attire essential." The municipal archives yielded the final pieces of the puzzle when Marcus investigated the building's history that afternoon. The Thornfield had opened with considerable fanfare in 1923. Its 12 original tenants, all prominent citizens, industrialists, physicians, a judge, 2 celebrated artists. On April 7, 1931, 11 of these individuals had gathered for a private dinner party on the 3rd floor. Only one emerged by morning. The newspapers reported a tragic accident, gas leak, carbon monoxide poisoning, bodies arranged around the dining table as though frozen mid-con conversation. The sole survivor, Helena Thornfield herself, had subsequently converted the entire floor to private use and established the draconian rules regarding access that persisted to the present day. What the papers failed to explain was why April 7th continued to claim precisely one Thornfield resident each year, their departure inevitably coinciding with the arrival of a new tenant who possessed certain sensitivities. Marcus ran trembling fingers across the invitation's embossed lettering, understanding at last the reason for his ex-wife's increasing hostility before their separation. She had been right all along. His pathological imagination was precisely what had drawn him to the Thornfield, and precisely what had drawn the Thornfield to him. The morning of April 7 dawned with an unseasonable chill, fog pressing against the Thornfield's windows like spectral fingers seeking entry. Marcus spent hours meticulously preparing his attire, a vintage tuxedo procured from a specialized haberdashery on Millbrook Lane, its styling precisely matching photographs from the 1920s that he'd studied with obsessive attention. Throughout the day, he observed subtle changes in his fellow residents. Mrs. Pembroke emerged from her office wearing a strand of pearls that appeared yellowed with age, yet gleamed with inner luminescence when she passed through the patches of sunlight that penetrated the lobby's stained glass transom. The twins from 4C carried between them an ancient steamer trunk which they struggled to maneuver up the stairwell, their synchronized movements suggesting a practiced ritual rather than spontaneous cooperation. Most telling was the building itself. The usual ambient sounds, pipes knocking, the elevator's mechanical weaves, the subtle settling of aged joists had fallen silent, as though the structure were holding its breath in anticipation. At precisely 7 o'clock, Marcus discovered a leather-bound volume resting on his drawing table, where no book had been before. Its spine bore no title. The cover decorated only with an embossed symbol resembling a circle bisected by 3 vertical lines. The pages within revealed themselves to be a journal. The handwriting elegant yet increasingly agitated as the entries progressed. April 1, 1931. Helena insists the ritual must proceed despite my objections. The pattern established by her grandfather cannot be broken without consequences she refuses to articulate. I have examined the original covenant. The language leaves little doubt regarding the price of withdrawal. Yet I cannot dismiss my reservations about what transpires in that room when the circle reaches completion. April 5, 1931. Preparations accelerate. The others remain oblivious, believing we gather merely to commemorate the building's anniversary. Only Helena and I understand what the shadowed presence requires for another cycle of prosperity. The selection process troubles me deeply. Thornfield claims she has no agency in choosing that the building itself identifies the most suitable vessel. I find this difficult to accept yet cannot deny the peculiar attributes shared by each person marked in previous years. April 7, 1931. The hour approaches. I have sealed this account within the walls of my apartment with instructions for its recovery should I not return. Though I have participated in 7 previous ceremonies, tonight feels different. Helena's demeanor has shifted subtly. She speaks of ascending rather than merely continuing. The ancient texts in the 3rd floor library warn against ambition when dealing with entities that exist partially beyond conventional dimensions. I fear she intends to alter the established exchange. Should anyone discover this record, know that what resides on the 3rd floor predates the Thornfield by centuries. The building was constructed around it, not to contain, but to channel. The annual sacrifice sustains not merely the residents, but the delicate membrane between what we understand as reality and something vastly more intricate. God forgive us all. The journal ended abruptly. When Marcus attempted to return to earlier pages for clarification, he discovered the writing had vanished, leaving only blank yellowed paper behind. The grandfather clock in the lobby began chiming 8 as the elevator ascended unbidden to his floor, its brass cage doors sliding open in silent invitation. Clear's throat, inside waited Mrs. Pembroke, her eyes reflecting a knowledge that transcended her apparent age. The circle has chosen, she said simply, extending a gloved hand. Helena awaits your decision. The elevator's descent was unnervingly smooth, devoid of the mechanical protests that typically announced its movement. Marcus stood beside Mrs. Pembroke in silence, watching the brass needle on the antiquated floor indicator shift with deliberate precision. When it settled precisely between floors 2 and 4, where no indicator mark existed, the cage halted with preternatural gentleness. She has waited 91 years for someone suitable, Mrs. Pembroke murmured as the doors parted to reveal a corridor that existed in defiance of the building's apparent architecture. Not every vessel possesses the necessary porosity. The hallway extended beyond what the building's exterior dimensions should have permitted, its walls adorned with damask wallpaper in deep crimson, interrupted at regular intervals by oil portraits whose subjects bore striking resemblances to current Thornfield residents. Gaslight sconces cast wavering illumination that transformed the corridor into something organic, pulsing with subtle movement that vanished when directly observed. Marcus felt the air change as he stepped forward, thicker, charged with potential, tasting faintly of ozone and copper. Each footfall upon the burgundy runner produced a curious echo, as though the sound traveled simultaneously forward and backward through time, rather than merely across physical space. The others have already assembled, Mrs. Pembroke continued, her voice acquiring harmonics that suggested multiple speakers. You alone were granted choice rather than compulsion, an honor Helena bestows rarely. At the corridor's end stood double doors of dark walnut, their surfaces carved with interlocking symbols that seemed to shift position when viewed peripherally. They swung inward without human touch as the pair approached, revealing a dining room whose dimensions fluctuated subtly with each pulse of the candle light. Around an oval table of polished obsidian sat 11 Thornfield residents, each attired in formal wear that spanned decades of fashion, yet somehow appeared cohesive within this timeless space. Their faces exhibited a peculiar translucence, features simultaneously distinct yet permeable, as though individual identity had become secondary to collective purpose. At the table's head sat a figure whose presence commanded the room, a woman of indeterminate age, her bearing aristocratic. Her gown an elaborate confection of 1920s beaded splendor. Her face framed by a perfect Marcel wave of copper-gold hair possessed a symmetry so precise it approached mathematical rather than biological perfection. Helena Thornfield. Marcus whispered recognition immediate. Despite having never seen her likeness, she smiled, revealing teeth too numerous and precisely arranged to be entirely human. The artist arrives, bringing perception that extends beyond mundane boundaries. Her voice resonated with acoustic properties that suggested vast spaces rather than the intimate dining room. We offer ascension rather than mere continuation. The clear's throat, previous observer proved inadequate. Marcus noticed then the 12th chair positioned directly opposite Helena was not empty as his dreams had suggested but occupied by a figure whose substance seemed to flicker between solidity and smoke, its features a blurred composite of human aspects. Arranged in subtly wrong configuration, Helena continued gesturing with elegant fingers that extended slightly too far from her wrist, is not whether to join us but whether to observe or participate in what comes after. The Thornfield requires maintenance, you see, reality requires boundaries. Some must stand guard at the threshold. Behind him, the doors sealed with an exhalation that suggested final closure rather than temporary seclusion. The choice before Marcus crystallized with terrible clarity as Helena extended her two long fingers toward the obsidian table surface. At her touch, the polished stone rippled like disturbed water, revealing scenes from the Thornfield's history. Moments unseen by common eyes and unrecorded in any public archive. Our covenant predates the building itself, Helena explained, her voice resonating with that impossible acoustic quality. When Ezekiel Thornfield acquired this parcel in 1879, he believed he was purchasing merely land. What he discovered beneath the soil proved far more consequential. The obsidian surface shimmered, revealing workmen in period attire, excavating a foundation. Their shovels struck something that caused the earth to tremble, uncovering not bedrock, but an ancient chamber whose walls bore symbols identical to those on the double doors. Within stood a stone plinth supporting nothing visible to conventional perception. Yet the workers recoiled as though confronting something unbearable. The threshold had been maintained by indigenous guardians for centuries, Helena continued. Their elimination left it unattended, weakening. My grandfather recognized its significance immediately. He had studied certain texts during his European travels that prepared him to understand what he had found. A juncture point between dimensions requiring regular stabilization. The scene shifted to reveal Ezekiel Thornfield conducting rituals in the excavated chamber, surrounded by 11 associates whose attire marked them as prominent citizens of the era. Their expressions betrayed a mixture of reverence and terror as they observed the space above the plinth distort in ways that defied natural law. The original covenant was simple, Helena said, her perfect teeth gleaming in the candle light. One vessel surrendered annually to maintain the boundary. The first building erected here served adequately until 1922 when the threshold began to expand. Greater containment became necessary. Marcus watched as construction crews demolished a modest Victorian structure, carefully preserving only the central chamber while building the current Thornfield around it. The architectural plans revealed deliberate irregularities, angles that appeared normal on paper, but created subtle spatial distortions when physically constructed. Hallways that seemed straight yet curved through dimensions beyond conventional geometry. In 1931, I recognized the potential for transcendence. Helena continued, why merely maintain when one could commune? The entity beyond the threshold offers knowledge beyond temporal constraints. I chose ascension. The previous observer, she gestured toward the flickering figure opposite her, has recorded faithfully for 9 decades, but lacks the perceptive faculties to properly interpret. The Thornfield residents seated around the table began a low, harmonious hum that caused the candle flames to dance in perfect synchronization. The air thickened further, pressure building against Marcus' eardrums as though he had descended far beneath the earth's surface. Every building has its secret heart, Helena whispered, though her voice penetrated the humming with perfect clarity. The Thornfield simply beats to rhythms established before humanity existed. Tonight you may replace our current observer, recording the threshold's fluctuations through your art. Or you may join me in ascension, becoming something far greater than merely human. From within his tuxedo pocket, Marcus felt the invitation card vibrating with increasing intensity, its paper transmuting to something warm and membranous against his fingers. The invitation no longer felt like paper beneath Marcus' fingers. It pulsated with a moist warmth, its texture transforming into something organic, a membrane thin enough to reveal intricate capillaries threading through its structure. When he withdrew it from his pocket, the formerly cream-colored card stock had become translucent, undulating gently as though breathing, the calligraphic text now appearing to float slightly above its surface. Decisions at thresholds carry weight beyond immediate consequence, Helena said, her voice somehow emanating from both her perfect mouth and from the invitation itself simultaneously. Our observer records but cannot interpret. The patterns require an artist's perception to translate properly. The flickering figure across from Helena began to stabilize its form, revealing a man in 1930s evening wear, his features handsome but increasingly gaunt as though substance had been gradually leaching from him over decades. His eyes fixed unblinkingly on Marcus contained a silent warning or perhaps a plea. Their irises fractured into kaleidoscopic patterns that reflected events occurring beyond the confines of the dining room. 91 years of faithful observation, Helena remarked, her two perfect fingers gesturing dismissively, yet increasingly inadequate as the threshold responds to external pressures. Modern physics, particularly quantum experiments, have agitated what lies beyond. The observer lacks the vocabulary to properly document the changes. The humming from the assembled residents intensified, acquiring harmonics that caused the crystal goblets on the table to vibrate at frequencies just beyond human comfort. The obsidian surface rippled more violently, revealing glimpses of what appeared to be the Thornfield itself, but suddenly wrong. Corridors extending into impossible geometries, apartments occupied by entities whose movements obeyed laws incongruous with terrestrial physics. What you perceive as the third floor, Helena explained, exists simultaneously in multiple states. The containment architecture channels these variations, preventing bleed-through into neighboring realities. Your drawings have already begun documenting these permutations without conscious understanding. Marcus felt a curious doubling of perception. His physical body remained seated at the table, while some essential aspect of his consciousness expanded outward, perceiving the Thornfield as a structure existing not merely in 3 dimensions, but as a complex lattice that branched through possibilities. Each apartment contained quantum superpositions of every potential tenant across decades, some more strongly manifested than others, their collective presence forming a stabilizing matrix around the central threshold. The observer across the table suddenly convulsed, his form losing coherence momentarily before resolidifying with visible effort. A trickle of mercury-like substance leaked from his left eye, tracking a silvery path down his cheek before dropping onto the invitation he clutched in trembling fingers. An exact duplicate of the membrane-like card Marcus held. His capacity diminishes with each cycle, Helena noted dispassionately. The threshold requires renewal through fresh perception. Your artistic sensibilities make you ideally suited to record the patterns as they evolve toward the inevitable convergence. The dining room's walls began to pulse visibly, their solid surfaces becoming permeable, revealing glimpses of what lay beyond. Not the expected hallway, but a vast non-Euclidean expanse where light behaved according to unfamiliar principles, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The membrane card in Marcus' hand pulsed with increasing urgency, its surface growing translucent enough that he could perceive script forming on its reverse side, not in ink, but in microscopic alterations of tissue and capillary. The writing appeared to be an addendum to the invitation, visible only when the card reached this metamorphosed state. The observer's contract binds consciousness to perception, Helena explained following his gaze. The artist becomes instrument. The threshold speaks through your chosen medium. Marcus became aware of subtle changes occurring within the assembled residents. Their outward appearance remained constant, but beneath the skin, alterations progressed. Bones gradually reorienting to accommodate geometries inconsistent with human anatomy. Circulatory systems adapting to transport substances beyond mere blood. These transformations occurred painlessly, welcomed even their expression suggesting a transcendent euphoria. "We are the building's nervous system, Mrs. Pembroke said, her voice containing undertones that suggested multiple speakers. We perceive its needs, respond to intrusions from beyond, maintain equilibrium through collective resonance." The twins from 4C spoke in perfect unison. Their formerly distinct voices now a single harmonic. The observer experiences directly what we process indirectly. The artist translates what the observer cannot articulate. A sonus bell tone emanated from somewhere beyond the dining room, causing ripples in the air that resembled heat distortion, but moved with deliberate intelligence. At this signal, the current observer's form destabilized more dramatically. Portions of his substance seeming to evaporate into the surrounding atmosphere while remaining loosely connected to his core being by filaments of silver-blue luminescence. April 7th marks the thinning, Helena said, rising from her chair with fluid grace that suggested joints arranged in configurations impossible for conventional human physiology. Every threshold requires maintenance. Every boundary must be renewed. She moved behind the deteriorating observer, placing her elongated hands upon his shoulders. At her touch, his dissolution accelerated, his formal attire collapsing inward as the substance beneath it dispersed into mist. Within seconds, only his eyes remained distinct, floating momentarily before Helena's face, their kaleidoscopic patterns spinning with increasing speed until they collapsed into pinpoints of intense light that she inhaled with reverent deliberation. The empty chair pulled itself forward, an invitation more compelling than the card that continued to transform in Marcus' grasp. Its texture now resembled vellum, but produced from no earthly animal, warm and receptive to impression, awaiting the first mark of a new observer. "The choice remains yours," Helena whispered, her voice now containing echoes of the absorbed observer. "Record for us the patterns of threshold fluctuation, translate through art what defies conventional documentation, or join me in the final ascension, becoming neither observer nor resident, but threshold itself." The obsidian table's surface stilled momentarily, reflecting Marcus with perfect clarity, except for one disturbing alteration. In the reflection, he already occupied the observer's chair, his hands covered in a substance that resembled liquid graphite, drawing patterns directly onto the table's surface with his fingertips. Marcus reached for the observer's chair with a peculiar sense of inevitability. The moment his fingertips touched its ornately carved armrests, a profound stillness descended upon the dining room. The humming of the assembled residents ceased abruptly, leaving an acoustic void that seemed to draw all sound inward rather than merely silencing it. Even Helena's breathing, a rhythm that had subtly influenced the atmospheric pressure within the chamber, suspended itself in anticipation. The transmuted invitation card in his left hand had completed its metamorphosis, now resembling a square of living tissue that adhered to his palm with microscopic filaments penetrating his skin. Clear's throat, the sensation was not painful, but intimate beyond comfort, as though the boundary between his body and the card had become theoretical rather than absolute. "The contract requires conscious acceptance," Helena instructed, her voice modulated to frequencies that bypassed his ears entirely. Manifesting directly within his auditory cortex. "Speak your intention clearly." Words formed unbidden in Marcus' mind. Phrases in languages he had never studied yet somehow comprehended perfectly. They described positions in dimensional configurations that human mathematics had yet to formalize. Delineated responsibilities involving perceptual monitoring of boundary integrity. Outlined penalties for observational negligence that transcended physical punishment. Before he could vocalize acceptance, however, a curious tremor passed through the building. Not the familiar settling of aged joists, but something deliberate and communicative. The obsidian table's surface rippled violently, its reflective quality transforming to reveal not the dining room and its occupants, but a separate reality occurring simultaneously in the same space. There, visible with perfect clarity, was the third floor as it existed in conventional dimensions. Not a mystical chamber, but a mundane space converted to storage. Cardboard boxes labeled by year contained financial records documenting the Thornfield's actual operations. Filing cabinets stood in regimented rows, their drawers partially open to reveal folders containing tenant applications spanning decades, each marked with cryptic notations identifying psychological vulnerabilities, creative tendencies, susceptibility to suggestion. Most damning was a journal open upon a simple desk, its pages covered in handwriting identical to Helena's elegant script, but documenting something far removed from interdimensional maintenance. Subject MW responding exceptionally well to atmospheric conditioning. Demonstrates heightened suggestibility following administration of compound H7 through ventilation system. Artistic tendencies make him ideal for this cycle's demonstration to potential investors. Previous subjects exhibited mental deterioration too rapidly, but refined chemical formulation promises extended coherence through hallucination phase. The revelation lasted mere seconds before Helena passed her elongated fingers through the table's surface, disrupting the image. Her perfect features reconfigured subtly, the mathematical precision of her symmetry intensifying beyond human parameters. "Curious," she remarked, her voice regaining its impossible acoustics. "The threshold occasionally reveals subjective interpretations rather than objective realities. Your artistic mind constructs narrative frameworks to process what exceeds conventional perception. This is precisely why you were selected." The assembled residents resumed their harmonic humming, the frequency now modulated to override cognitive dissonance. Marcus felt his momentary clarity begin to dissolve as the chemical equilibrium Helena had established reasserted itself through the building's carefully engineered ventilation system, which had been designed not to accommodate interdimensional entities, but to distribute aerosolized compounds with precision throughout the Thornfield's confined spaces. The diary page beneath the illusion trembled in Marcus' visual field. Fragments of reality attempting to pierce the veil of chemically induced perception as if struggling against the current of the resident's harmonic humming. Additional entries materialized. April 7, 1984. Subject displayed exceptional resilience to the hallucinogenic protocol. Maintained coherent speech patterns even while describing impossible geometries. Cardiovascular collapse occurred 17 minutes after peak experience. Recommend reducing dosage for next demonstration cycle. April 7, 1995. Investment group from Vienna expressed satisfaction with demonstration. Subjects, clears throat, artistic renderings of threshold entities proved particularly compelling. 3 new financial commitments secured. H7 formula continues to produce reliable results with minimal environmental contamination risk. Marcus felt his body attempting to reject what his mind was processing. A cold sweat breaking across his forehead, pupils dilating against the candle light that now revealed itself as carefully calibrated wavelengths designed to enhance chemical susceptibility. The invitation card fused to his palm no longer seemed organic, but synthetic, a transdermal delivery system disguised as mystical contract. What Helena termed ascension revealed itself in flashes of clarity. Previous observers, artistic souls like himself, their final moments captured in clinical photography. Their expressions of transcendent rapture belied by dilated pupils and hemorrhaged capillaries, bodies contorted not by dimensional translation, but by profound neurotoxic response. The Thornfield had never contained an interdimensional threshold. It housed something far more mundane yet equally insidious. A generations-long experiment in controlled perception and psychological manipulation perfected by the original Helena Thornfield and maintained by her descendants under the same name, creating an unbroken lineage of authority. Mrs. Pembroke, or whoever truly occupied that identity, leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails now revealing themselves as delivery mechanisms, their tips glistening with a substance that caught the light with oily iridescence. The threshold requires contact, she murmured, reaching for Marcus' exposed wrist, where his pulse visibly raced beneath thin skin. Behind the residence, the dining room's walls continued their illusory dissolution. Yet in the momentary clarity of his chemical fluctuation, Marcus perceived their true nature. Projection surfaces of remarkable sophistication, displaying imagery generated from his own subconscious, extracted during sleep through the building's specialized monitoring systems. A document visible on the periphery of the obsidian table caught his fading attention. Letterhead reading Thornfield Pharmaceutical Research Division. Its contents detailing the extraordinary success of subject-generated narratives in creating sustainable mythology for test environment. As Mrs. Pembroke's fingers made contact with his skin, Marcus felt the final surge of chemical compound entering his bloodstream, his perception split between the magnificent cosmic horror his mind constructed to process his experience and the sterile truth of the Thornfield's actual purpose. Not a guardian of reality's boundaries, but a laboratory whose subjects generated their own elaborate justifications for what was being done to them. The residents' humming intensified, their voices guiding his consciousness down pathways carefully constructed over decades of refinement. The choice Helena had offered was no choice at all, merely the illusion of agency in a process designed to eliminate any possibility of resistance. With singular clarity amidst the chemical fog enveloping his consciousness, Marcus recognized the third option that Helena had never mentioned. Neither observation nor ascension, but revelation. His fingers, trembling with effort, reached not for the offered chair, but for his breast pocket, where he had secreted his most fundamental tool, a simple graphite pencil worn to half its original length through years of artistic devotion. As his hand closed around it, the implement seemed to pulse with authentic power utterly distinct from the manufactured mysticism surrounding him. "There has always been a third choice," Marcus whispered, his voice cutting through the resident's harmonic manipulation with unexpected authority. "The artist doesn't merely observe or submit, he creates." With movement too decisive to intercept, Marcus drove the pencil's point into the membrane card fused to his palm. The synthetic delivery system ruptured, releasing its remaining compound not into his bloodstream, but onto the obsidian table's surface. The liquid spread with deliberate intelligence, revealing its chemical composition through reactions with the polished stone. Compounds bearing molecular structures that would be prohibited in any regulated research facility. Helena's perfect features contorted with an emotion far removed from transcendence. Common earthbound frustration. Extraordinary resistance, she remarked to Mrs. Pembroke, her voice stripped of its dimensional harmonics, now clinically precise. Note the subject's autonomic response pattern for formula refinement. The humming resonance faltered in their sonic manipulation as Marcus rose unsteadily from his chair. The room's projected boundaries fluctuated as his compromised perceptual system struggled against pharmaceutical control. Through sheer will, he staggered toward what appeared as ornate double doors, but revealed themselves intermittently as a standard emergency exit. No subject has rejected integration during final administration. Helena observed with detached interest, making no move to physically restrain him. The documentation value exceeds the demonstration loss. The exit mechanism yielded to Marcus' weight as he collapsed against it. Beyond lay not the impossible corridor of his induced hallucination, but the utilitarian concrete of a fire stairwell. Harsh fluorescent lighting replaced ethereal candle glow, transforming the transcendent experience to sterile reality with brutal efficiency. As the door swung closed behind him, Marcus glimpsed the residents removing small audio devices from beneath their formal attire, their expressions neither malevolent nor transcendent, but professionally detached. Helena's voice carried through the narrowing opening, dictating clinical observations for official record. The stairwell offered no mystical revelation, but something far more valuable. Untainted air and distance from the specialized ventilation system. With each descending step, chemical clarity returned incrementally. The building's true nature assembled itself in his consciousness. Not an interdimensional nexus, but an elaborate testing facility disguised as residential architecture. Its apartments carefully monitoring subjects for pharmacological research spanning generations. Marcus' fingers, still stained with the compound from the ruptured delivery system, left smeared evidence along the handrail. Tangible proof that would resist narrative reconstruction. The Thornfield's most closely guarded secret was neither occult threshold nor dimensional maintenance, but the mundane horror of unconated human experimentation conducted beneath the veneer of architectural curiosity. Raindrops streaked the lobby windows of the Thornfield as Marcus stumbled into the early dawn light of April 8th. His tuxedo disheveled and stained with substances that defied conventional analysis. The sky hung low and oppressive, a canvas of bruised indigo giving way reluctantly to the pallid illumination of morning. Each breath of untainted air served to further dissipate the chemical fog that had enveloped his consciousness throughout that interminable night. The street before him lay deserted, save for a solitary newspaper delivery van whose driver paid him no heed. Another calculated element of the Thornfield's operation, perhaps, or merely the fortunate coincidence of urban indifference. Marcus pressed trembling fingers against the cold iron railing that bordered the building's entrance steps, anchoring himself to tangible reality as the last vestiges of pharmaceutical manipulation ebbed from his system. His reflection in a rain-slicked puddle revealed a man transformed. Hollow-eyed and gaunt, yet possessed of a terrible clarity that no chemical formulation could now obscure. The puddle's surface rippled as droplets fell from the building's ornate cornices, distorting his image in concentric patterns that momentarily resembled the obsidian table's surface. Even now, his perceptions remained susceptible to pattern recognition triggered by the compound's residual effects. Behind him, the Thornfield's facade presented its customary dignified decay to the awakening city. No evidence of its true purpose revealed itself to casual observation. The weathered brick and ornate architectural embellishments maintained their perfect camouflage. How many pedestrians passed this structure daily, utterly unaware of the calculated horrors orchestrated within? How many had dismissed their intuitive unease as mere architectural intimidation rather than subconscious recognition of deliberate manipulation? The distant wail of sirens penetrated the morning mist, their Doppler fluctuation suggesting vehicles moving in multiple directions, approaching perhaps, or merely patrolling their customary routes through Millfield's Rain SL. Marcus contemplated the profound implausibility of his position. Who would believe his testimony against an institution so thoroughly insulated by generations of carefully cultivated respectability? His artist's fingers twitched with urgent purpose, though the tremors of chemical withdrawal complicated their precision. The evidence he had inadvertently collected. Compound residue still tacky beneath his fingernails. Transdermal delivery residue adhering to his palm would dissipate without documentation. Scientific validation required samples. Preservation methods beyond his current capacity. The Thornfield's entrance door swung open with deliberate lang anger, revealing Mrs. Pembroke's silhouette framed by the amber illumination of the lobby. Her silver-streaked chignon remained immaculate despite the night's activities, her posture suggesting not pursuit, but patient expectation. In her outstretched hand, she held what appeared to be his leather sketchbook recovered from his apartment while he had been otherwise engaged. "Your extraordinary perceptual documentation deserves continuation," she called, her voice carrying across the intervening space with unnerving precision despite the rainfall's acoustic interference. Few subjects achieve your level of integration while maintaining cognitive coherence. The sketchbook, containing every illustration of his induced visions, represented both evidence and liability. Its contents simultaneously damning testimony and potential dismissal as mere artistic delusion. The choice facing Marcus transcended mere escape. It demanded strategic consideration of how truth might be preserved against a mythology cultivated across nearly a century of meticulous orchestration. The evidence adhering to Marcus' skin represented a fragile truth vulnerable to both time and the Thornfield's methodical eraser. As the rainwater began dissolving the chemical compound staining his fingers, he made his decision. Not flight, but documentation. With deliberate movements that belied his physical deterioration, Marcus retrieved his mobile telephone from his tuxedo pocket, a modern intrusion in the carefully orchestrated period aesthetic the Thornfield cultivated. The device's screen illuminated his haggard features as he activated its camera function, meticulously photographing his contaminated palm, the residue beneath his fingernails, the distinctive stains marking his formal attire. Mrs. Pembroke's expression remained impassive as she observed his documentation efforts, though a subtle tightening around her eyes betrayed calculation rather than concern. Digital evidence proves remarkably susceptible to credibility challenges, she remarked, her voice carrying precisely through the rainfall, particularly when generated by individuals with your artistic temperament and chemical exposure history. The implications crystallized with terrible clarity. The Thornfield's defensive architecture extended beyond its physical walls into the realm of narrative control. Any testimony he might offer would be systematically undermined through carefully established parameters. His professional identity as an illustrator of imaginative works, his documented divorce citing his pathological imagination, the strategic isolation that had rendered him an ideal experimental subject. Nevertheless, Marcus continued his documentation with methodical precision, transmitting each image to multiple remote servers before the evidence could be intercepted or degraded. The chemical residue might dissipate, but its digital ghost would persist beyond the Thornfield's immediate sphere of influence. The observation cycle requires completion, Mrs. Pembroke called, advancing one precise step beyond the threshold. Your predecessor maintained the protocol for 9 decades through chemical management. Your resistance, while statistically anomalous, remains ultimately futile. Her words carried an administrative finality utterly divorced from the mystical pretense of Helena's performance. The truth of the Thornfield revealed itself not through supernatural revelation, but bureaucratic pragmatism, a research program sustained through generational commitment to methodological continuity rather than dimensional maintenance. As Marcus completed his documentation, a peculiar transformation manifested in his demeanor. Not chemical capitulation, but artistic resolve. The Thornfield had selected him precisely for his perceptual sensitivity and creative interpretation. Qualities that now served not their experimental protocol, but its exposure. The third floor was never forbidden, he stated with quiet certainty, his voice steady despite pharmaceutical after effects. Merely restricted to maintain experimental isolation. The building's architecture serves not containment but controlled administration. Mrs. Pembroke's practiced composure faltered momentarily, confirming his deduction through micro-expressions too instinctive to suppress. The mythology of the Thornfield, cultivated across decades of careful narrative construction, confronted the simplicity of exposed methodology. No interdimensional threshold required maintenance. Only pharmaceutical research demanded discretion. The distant sirens drew nearer, their Doppler fluctuation resolving into approaching vectors rather than ambient urban soundscape. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps consequence of his digital transmissions finding receptive analysis. The Thornfield's carefully maintained isolation faced imminent intersection with external scrutiny. The rainfall intensified as Marcus stood his ground, each droplet striking the pavement with percussive finality that seemed to mark the seconds of a countdown. The Thornfield loomed behind Mrs. Pembroke like a patient predator. Its weathered facade no longer evoking architectural nostalgia, but clinical containment. A carefully designed vessel preserving its secrets through aesthetic misdirection. The sketchbook in Mrs. Pembroke's outstretched hand had begun to darken as rainwater penetrated its leather binding, causing the pages to swell and distort. The illustrations within, those manifestations of chemically guided perception, would soon blur into watercolor abstractions, their specific evidence dissolving while preserving only impressionistic suggestion of what he had witnessed. Your documentation lacks contextual framework, Mrs. Pembroke observed, her voice acquiring the dispassionate quality of scientific notation rather than supernatural invitation. Isolated chemical samples without experimental protocols. Images without interpretive methodology. You offer fragments without the narrative architecture necessary for comprehension. The truth of her assessment penetrated Marcus' momentary triumph. The Thornfield's defense lay not in denial but in complexity. Decades of carefully structured research impossible to articulate through fragmentary evidence. His testimony would compete against institutional credibility built across generations. His chemical-stained fingertips against laboratories of controlled documentation. Yet something shifted in the atmospheric pressure surrounding them beyond mere meteorological fluctuation. The Thornfield itself seemed to exhale. Its aged ventilation systems adjusting to changing barometric conditions. From the third-floor windows, those mundane apertures disguised as mysterious portals, came the unmistakable sounds of systematic activity, cabinets closing, electronic equipment powering down. The methodical destruction of evidence initiated by protocols established long before either of them had entered the building sphere. The cycle adapts rather than terminates, Mrs. Pembroke stated, lowering the sketchbook as though its purpose had been fulfilled. Your resistance represents data rather than disruption. Helena anticipated statistical anomalies and subject-response patterns. The approaching sirens divided, surrounding the building's perimeter with tactical precision rather than emergency response. Professional containment rather than rescue. Another layer of the Thornfield's defensive architecture revealing itself. The boundary between experimental space and external authority blurred, suggesting institutional continuity rather than oppositional forces. Marcus' perception, heightened by both chemical residue and desperate clarity, detected subtle transformations in the building's external appearance. Maintenance workers emerged from service entrances, their movements too precise for conventional labor, beginning modifications to architectural details that would render his photographic documentation inconsistent with observable reality within hours. The Thornfield was not merely a fixed structure, but a mutable organism, continuously adapting its external presentation to invalidate historical record. The rain-slick street reflected these activities in fractured inverted tableau, creating a disorienting symmetry between reality and its distorted mirror image. In this liminal space between exposure and eraser, Marcus recognized the true nature of his position. Not heroic whistleblower, but merely the latest iteration in an experimental continuity designed to absorb and neutralize every potential revelation. The final vehicles converged upon the Thornfield with precision that suggested orchestration rather than coincidence. Their black surfaces gleamed like car opaques under the strengthening dawn light, windshield wipers creating hypnotic arcs that seemed to erase reality itself with each pass. Men and women emerged wearing expressions of identical professional detachment. Not law enforcement, as Marcus had momentarily hoped, but personnel whose movements betrayed institutional familiarity with the building and its protocols. Mrs. Pembroke's posture subtly transformed as they approached, her administrative authority yielding to their more specialized presence. These were not allies arriving to validate Marcus' discoveries, but custodians of continuity, practitioners of the methodology that sustained the Thornfield's experiments across generations. Their arrival represented not exposure, but consolidation, the closing of a compromised cycle, and the preparation for renewal. The observation continues under modified parameters, announced a silver-haired man whose immaculate suit repelled raindrops with unnatural efficiency. Subject response has been documented for future protocol refinement. Marcus felt the last vestige of hope dissolve like the chemical residue washing from his fingertips. The Thornfield had never operated in isolation, but existed within a framework of institutional protection that extended beyond the building's physical boundaries. His documentation, his resistance, his momentary clarity, all had been anticipated, measured, and incorporated into the experimental architecture with the same precision that had designed the building's deceptive facade. The silver-haired man extended his hand not toward Marcus, but toward Mrs. Pembroke, who relinquished the rain-damaged sketchbook with practiced deference. Narrative reconstruction will commence immediately, he stated, examining the sodden pages with clinical interest. Subject artistic tendencies provide exceptional visualization of induced perceptions. Flag for potential graphical inclusion in subsequent documentation. What Marcus had interpreted as exposure revealed itself as merely transition. His role shifting from active subject to archived data point in the Thornfield's continuing research. The building would remain, its third floor restricted, its new tenants carefully selected for perceptual susceptibilities that aligned with experimental objectives. The mythology would persist, adapting to incorporate elements of resistance within its expanding narrative framework. As the personnel encircled him with methodical efficiency, Marcus recognized that his struggle against the Thornfield's manufactured reality had never threatened its continuation, but merely refined its methodology. The building had absorbed his resistance as it had absorbed every challenge across 91 years of operation through systematic documentation, analysis, and adaptation. His final clarity, as rain-diluted chemicals completed their dissolution into background concentration, was the recognition that the Thornfield's true horror lay not in interdimensional thresholds or mystic covenants, but in the mundane persistence of institutional momentum, the relentless continuity of research protocols sustained beyond individual lifespans. The clinical detachment that transformed human perception into experimental data points. The architectural camouflage that concealed methodical exploitation beneath aesthetic nostalgia. The Thornfield would continue. The third floor would remain restricted, and somewhere a new tenant would receive written warning never to ask about what lay beyond those locked doors. The Thornfield's shadow persisted through seasons of change. Its silhouette against Millfield's skyline, an architectural reminder of secrets preserved rather than exposed. Municipal records regarding the events of that April morning became curiously fragmented. Reports filed but never processed. Digital evidence quarantined within systems that subsequently experienced catastrophic failure. Witness statements contradicting themselves in successive interviews until credibility dissolved beneath inconsistency. The building underwent subtle transformations in the months following. Its weathered brick facade received meticulous restoration that somehow altered its fundamental character while maintaining historical appearance. Windows were replaced with panes whose glass thickness subtly distorted both inward and outward views. The brass elevator, once vocal in its mechanical protests, now ascended with disking silence between floors. Pembroke retired with ceremonial acknowledgement, her replacement, a younger woman whose silver-streaked shine-on and rigid posture suggested continuity through selection rather than coincidence. The brass nameplate on the ground floor office changed. Yet the methodical interview process for prospective tenants remained unaltered, including the provision regarding third-floor restrictions outlined in red on the final page of each lease agreement. Apartment 2C stood vacant for precisely 49 days. Workers entered daily, their specialized equipment suggesting decontamination rather than mere renovation. The walls were stripped to structural elements and reconstructed with materials whose composition underwent rigorous testing before installation. The ventilation system received particular attention. New ductwork featuring filtration mechanisms of remarkable sophistication. Marcus Whitaker's professional reputation underwent systematic reconfiguration. Art galleries previously interested in his illustrations received documentation suggesting psychological deterioration predating his Thornfield residency. His digital presence acquired retrospective inconsistencies. Social media posts modified to introduce themes of paranoia months before his accusations. Email correspondence with his former spouse edited to emphasize delusional tendencies rather than creative differences. His current whereabouts remain officially unacknowledged. Occasional reports surface from specialized treatment facilities describing a patient whose artistic abilities manifest exclusively through attempts to document pharmaceutical experiences that administrators classify as delusional constructs. His illustrations carefully preserved in institutional archives depict with remarkable consistency the architectural impossibilities of the Thornfield's third floor. Spatial anomalies dismissed as symptomatic manifestations rather than observational documentation. The obsidian table from the dining room was relocated to corporate headquarters whose address appears in no public registry. Its surface, when properly illuminated, continues displaying patterns that executives describe as subject-response visualization in quarterly reports distributed to shareholders whose identities remain protected through elaborate financial structures. New tenants occupy the Thornfield now, their selection criteria refined through analysis of Marcus resistance patterns. Their lease agreements include provisions for atmospheric quality monitoring and consent to historical architectural experience enhancement. The building's ventilation system operates with precision calibrated to individual metabolic profiles, delivering molecular compounds whose classification exists in research categories exempt from conventional regulatory oversight. The third floor remains restricted. The elevator bypasses it without hesitation. The stairwell doors display their warning signs, though the text has been modified to incorporate subtle linguistic triggers that discourage curiosity through subconscious aversion rather than explicit prohibition. The Thornfield continues its patient observation, its architectural presence a monument to institutional persistence rather than supernatural manifestation. And in certain dreams across Millfield and beyond, individuals of particular perceptual sensitivity sometimes glimpse corridors of impossible geometry illuminated by amber light, where shadows move with deliberate intelligence beneath flickering gas lamps that were never actually installed. The archives of Millfield Historical Society hold a curious collection of architectural drawings dating to the early 20th century, meticulously preserved in acid-free folders and rarely requested by visitors. Among these documents lies a comparison study of 6 apartment buildings constructed between 1919 and 1925, commissioned by the city's Urban Development Committee as part of a never-published assessment of residential standards. 5 of these structures exhibit conventional design principles of the era. Pragmatic floor layouts, standardized ventilation systems, uniform ceiling heights throughout all levels. The Thornfield, however, presents anomalies that the committee's notations describe as structural peculiarities, warranting further investigation. The third floor's ceiling height exceeds standard dimensions by precisely 17 inches. The ventilation system follows unconventional patterns with air intake and outflow calibrated differently than surrounding floors. Most notably, the electrical wiring diagram indicates specialized circuitry feeding that level alone, isolated from the building's main system through what the engineer's notes term redundant separation protocols, unnecessary for residential application. This documentation preceded by several years the first written reference to the third floor's restricted status. The amendment to the building's operational charter filed with the Municipal Housing Authority in 1929 describes the level as reserved for specialized residential research. A designation that bypassed standard inspection protocols through exemptions granted by signatures that subsequent investigation reveals belonged to individuals who simultaneously served on both regulatory boards and research institution governance committees. The Thornfield's unique architectural profile emerged during an era when the boundaries between scientific advancement and institutional oversight remained deliberately permeable. The post-war decades witnessed pharmaceutical experimentation conducted within frameworks that prioritize discovery over documentation, progress over protection. Universities maintained special research divisions whose activities received minimal external scrutiny. Their findings circulated through private correspondence, rather than published journals. Their methodology shaped by objectives unrestricted by standardized ethical considerations. What distinguished the Thornfield from conventional research facilities was not merely its methodological approach, but its temporal commitment. The recognition that certain investigations required observational continuity beyond individual careers or even generations. The building's design incorporated this philosophical premise into its physical structure, creating an environment where experimental protocols could evolve while maintaining unbroken application. The correspondence between Helena Thornfield and Professor Emil Reichmann of Vienna's Institute for Perceptual Studies, preserved in the university's restricted archives, illuminates this perspective. Conventional research frameworks remain inadequate for investigations requiring decades of controlled observation. The subject-environment relationship must sustain itself through self-perpetuating mechanisms rather than external maintenance. We have designed not merely a facility but an organism capable of continuing its function regardless of individual oversight. This philosophical approach transformed the Thornfield from mere building into methodological entity, an architectural embodiment of research continuity that transcended its human administrators. Each property manager inherited not just operational responsibilities, but custodianship of protocols designed to sustain experimental integrity across decades. Each tenant selection process served dual purposes: maintaining the building's financial viability while identifying perceptual sensitivities aligned with ongoing research parameters. The true innovation lay not in the chemical compounds themselves, but in their delivery architecture. A building designed to function as both experimental environment and administration mechanism capable of sustaining research continuity through institutional momentum rather than individual guidance. The Thornfield stands as monument not to supernatural phenomena, but to institutional persistence. The capacity of methodological frameworks to sustain themselves beyond their creators' lifespans, continuing their function with mechanical precision long after their original purpose has been obscured by layers of administrative evolution. The truth of the Thornfield endured not through mystical persistence, but through meticulous documentation. In the climate-controlled repository of the Millfield University Special Collections, a leather portfolio bearing no identifying markers contains photographic evidence predating digital manipulation. Images captured by an architectural assessment team in 1972 when the building underwent structural evaluation following a minor earthquake. Their inspection penetrated briefly to the restricted third floor through a temporary access point created by shifted masonry in the northeast stairwell. The photographs reveal no interdimensional threshold nor mystical gathering space, but something perhaps more disturbing in its mundane precision. A floor designed as perfect observational architecture. Apartments arranged not for occupancy but for monitoring. Their walls containing one-way viewing ports disguised as ventilation grates. Centralized recording equipment connected to every surrounding unit through concealed conduits. A laboratory where the experiment was not conducted but merely coordinated. The true research subjects being the residents themselves living in perpetual observation without knowledge or consent. Winter light now falls differently upon the Thornfield's facade. The angle of illumination revealing subtle alterations made during recent restoration work. The cornices no longer cast precisely the same shadows that generations of Millfield residents had unconsciously registered when passing the building. The windows reflect sunlight with slightly different refraction properties. Their replacement glass containing compounds that filter specific wavelengths with pharmaceutical implications only recently documented in restricted research publications. The apartment once occupied by Marcus Whitaker now houses Eliza Chambers, a doctoral candidate in neurochemical architecture whose academic credentials conceal specialized training in transitional research methodology. Her presence represents not continuation but evolution. The Thornfield's protocols adapting to incorporate awareness of previous exposure risk. Where once the building operated through deception maintained by chemical influence, it now functions through informed complicity disguised as academic inquiry. In her precisely arranged living room, Eliza reviews monitoring data collected from adjacent units, analyzing perceptual response patterns with professional detachment. The ventilation system still delivers calibrated compounds, but their formulation has evolved beyond crude hallucinogenic manipulation towards subtle cognitive enhancement, creating not delusions, but heightened pattern recognition that residents attribute to artistic inspiration or academic insight rather than external influence. The third floor remains restricted, but its purpose has transformed. No longer merely observational control center, it now functions as analytical nexus where generational data undergoes evaluation. The accumulated perceptual documentation of 9 decades of residents providing baseline metrics for cognitive response modeling that extends beyond the Thornfield's limited architectural scope. Autumn rain falls upon the building's weathered brick. Each droplet tracing paths that seem random but follow patterns established by microscopic surface treatments applied during restoration. The Thornfield continues its patient observation. No longer dependent upon a single observer, but functioning as distributed network of perception. Each tenant contributing unknowingly to accumulated data architecture that expands beyond individual awareness. The building's greatest achievement was never interdimensional maintenance, but institutional persistence. The capacity to evolve methodologies while maintaining operational continuity, adapting its fundamental research approach while preserving the essential fiction that separates residents from awareness of their participation. In this transformation lies the true horror of the Thornfield, not that it harbors supernatural threshold, but that it continues precisely as designed. An architectural embodiment of observation without consent, persistence without oversight, research without ethical constraint. The final truth of the Thornfield manifested not through sudden revelation, but through the patient accumulation of fragmented evidence, historical documents intersecting with architectural anomalies, institutional correspondence colliding with pharmaceutical patents. In the Special Collections Room of Millfield University's Hard Grove Library, a slender volume bound in faded maroon leather bears the innocuous title, Architectural Innovations in Residential Psychology, 1920 to 1940. Its pages, yellowed with age, but meticulously preserved, contain a single paragraph that illuminates the Thornfield's true purpose with clinical precision. The sustained administration of perceptual compounds requires architectural delivery systems beyond conventional laboratory environments. Subject retention and consistent dosage present challenges that cannot be addressed through traditional research methodologies. The Thornfield model demonstrates how residential architecture can function as both delivery mechanism and observational framework, creating closed experimental ecosystems where subjects generate their own justifications for physiological and psychological alterations. The narrative membrane, a self-perpetuating mythology regarding spatial restrictions, provides both administrative control and subject compliance without resource-intensive supervision. This passage, authored by Dr. Werner Kessler of the now-defunct Continental Research Association, appeared in only 17 printed copies before institutional consolidation removed all references to the Thornfield by name from subsequent editions. The volume's provenance traces to the personal collection of Millfield's former mayor, whose administration approved the building's original construction permits through expedited processes that bypassed standard safety inspections. The Thornfield's architectural peculiarities extend beyond its forbidden third floor. The marble in the lobby contains microscopic veining of compounds whose molecular structure resembles pharmaceutical precursors activated through skin contact. The brass fixtures throughout common areas incorporate metallic compositions whose slow oxidation releases trace elements that enhance neural receptivity when inhaled over extended periods. Even the distinctive creaking of certain floorboards produces sound frequencies documented in restricted acoustic research as perception preparatory stimuli. Most revealing are the building's water system specifications preserved in municipal engineering archives. The copper piping serving individual apartments features specialized filtration mechanisms oriented not to remove external contaminants but to introduce precisely calibrated substances from internal reservoirs. These mechanisms, described in accompanying documentation as mineral enrichment protocols for resident health optimization, connect to a centralized dispensary located within the restricted third floor where compound formulations could be modified for all residents simultaneously or adjusted for specific units based on observational priorities. The Thornfield stands as testament not to supernatural presence but to institutional patience. The capacity to conduct experimental protocols across decades through architectural implementation rather than human administration. Its greatest achievement was creating a self-sustaining research environment where subjects generated their own explanatory frameworks for their experiences, attributing to mystical or interdimensional causes what were merely pharmaceutical effects delivered through environmental engineering. The building continues its patient observation. Its weathered facade concealing delivery mechanisms of remarkable sophistication. Each rainfall that traces paths down its brick exterior distributes compounds that penetrate through microscopic architectural channels. Each breeze that circulates through its corridors carries precisely calibrated molecular structures. The Thornfield requires no interdimensional maintenance because it maintains itself. An architectural organism designed to perpetuate research protocols beyond human lifespans, continuing its methodical documentation of perception long after its original purpose has been obscured by administrative evolution. The Thornfield's legacy extends far beyond its physical presence on Hemlock Street. As decades pass, its methodologies silently propagate through institutional frameworks like mycelia beneath forest soil, unseen but fundamentally altering the ecosystem above. Architectural firms throughout the eastern seaboard incorporate elements of its design and residential developments. Their blueprints containing subtle adaptations of ventilation systems that pharmaceutical engineers recognize with professional appreciation but never publicly acknowledge. Former residents of the building exhibit statistically significant cognitive patterns that distinguish them from the general population. Their creative works, whether literary, visual, or musical, contain recurring motifs that trained analysts can identify through algorithmic assessment. Artists who spent even brief periods within the Thornfield's influence produce compositions featuring distinctive spatial distortions. Writers develop narrative structures that psycholinguists describe as perception-adjacent stories that seem to exist simultaneously in multiple interpretive frameworks. Musicians compose pieces containing frequency combinations that neurological researchers note create predictable emotional responses in listeners. The term Thornfield effect appears in classified psychological literature to describe perceptual alterations that persist after chemical exposure ceases. Subjects demonstrate heightened pattern recognition capabilities coupled with increased susceptibility to suggestion characteristics that certain government agencies find particularly valuable for specialized positions. Recruitment protocols now include assessment metrics designed to identify individuals who display these traits without triggering awareness of their significance. Millfield itself bears the Thornfield's imprint in subtle manifestations that shape civic development. The City Planning Commission, whose members once included several former building residents, approved architectural guidelines favoring structures with specific proportional relationships and ventilation requirements that replicate on municipal scale what the Thornfield pioneered in residential application. Public spaces throughout Millfield incorporate design elements that neurological research correlates with heightened receptivity to environmental influence. Bench placements that encourage specific sitting postures, lighting arrangements that induce particular cognitive states, acoustic properties that enhance certain frequency ranges while dampening others. Most profound remains the building's contribution to institutional methodology, the demonstration that research continuity can transcend individual human limitation through architectural embodiment. Universities with specialized neurochemical divisions study the Thornfield not as paranormal anomaly but as operational paradigm, its administrative structure providing template for programs requiring generational commitment. The principle of architectural administration where physical environments maintain experimental protocols independent of human supervision appears in restricted research publications as established methodology rather than theoretical approach. The ultimate testament to the Thornfield's significance manifests not in supernatural persistence but in institutional replication. 6 buildings constructed across the eastern United States between 1974 and 2008 incorporate its fundamental design principles. Their developers connected through academic lineage to the original research team. These structures operate not as isolated experiments but as work nodes in expanded observational framework. Their aggregate data contributing to perceptual modeling projects whose implications extend beyond individual buildings into broader social architecture. The third floor remains restricted, its purpose protected not by mystical barriers, but by institutional momentum, the implacable continuity of methodologies that sustain themselves through administrative evolution rather than individual commitment. The Thornfield endures not because it houses interdimensional threshold, but because it became precisely what its designers intended, architecture that functions as perpetual experiment, observing human perception across generations with mechanical patience that transcends human limitation. The Thornfield's most profound legacy is not the lives it has altered or the perceptions it has manipulated, but the philosophical question it embodies, a question whispered through its corridors on nights when barometric pressure shifts and ventilation systems adjust their molecular distribution with mechanical precision. Between the weathered bricks and behind the ornate cornices lies the unsettling proposition that reality itself might be merely consensual architecture constructed through perceptual agreement rather than objective existence. During the winter solstice, when daylight wanes to its briefest duration and shadows stretch across Hemlock Street with elongated significance, the building achieves peak operational efficiency. Its delivery systems, those intricate networks of copper piping, specialized ventilation ducts, and microscopically treated surfaces, function with synchronized purpose, creating an atmospheric equilibrium that residents experience as inexplicable calm or creative inspiration. The solstice represents not mystical convergence, but optimal environmental conditions for compound distribution, a fact documented in quarterly reports submitted to oversight committees whose existence remains unacknowledged in public records. The true revelation of the Thornfield lies not in what it contains but in what it represents. The perfect marriage of architecture and manipulation where physical structure becomes both delivery system and justification. The forbidden third floor serves not as mystical nexus but as psychological anchor. The absent center around which residents construct elaborate narratives that explain their altered perceptions without questioning their fundamental reality. This elegant solution to experimental compliance remains the building's most significant contribution to institutional methodology. Subjects who generate their own explanatory frameworks require minimal administrative maintenance. Most disturbing among the Thornfield's innovations was the discovery that chemical influence becomes unnecessary once architectural suggestion has been established. After sufficient exposure, residents maintain altered perceptual patterns even during periods when compound distribution is suspended for system maintenance. The building discovered through patient observation across decades that human perception will sustain artificially established patterns through sheer cognitive momentum, requiring only occasional reinforcement rather than continuous administration. The weathered brick facade, the ornate cornices casting their familiar shadows across Rain's cobblestones, the amber glow of gaslight-inspired lamps in the evening hours. These elements form not merely aesthetic presentation, but functional components in a delivery system of remarkable sophistication. Each architectural detail serves dual purpose. Historical verisimilitude that residents consciously appreciate while unconsciously absorbing the compounds these features distribute through contact, inhalation, or subtle acoustic influence. Beneath the Thornfield's foundation, in chambers accessible only through maintenance tunnels whose existence has been systematically removed from building records, rests the ultimate evidence of institutional foresight. Storage facilities containing compound formulations sufficient to maintain operations for 2 additional centuries secured in environmental conditions designed to prevent degradation. This physical testament to long-term planning reveals the true scope of the building's intended purpose. Not temporary experiment, but permanent observation, continuing its methodical documentation of human perception, regardless of external circumstances or administrative changes. The Thornfield stands as monument not to supernatural presence but to institutional ambition. Architecture designed to perpetuate itself beyond human limitation. Continuing its patient observation of residents who never truly grasp that they inhabit not merely a building, but an experiment that has long since transcended its creator's original purpose. The thin boundary between perception and reality dissolves most completely during electrical storms. Lightning transforms the Thornfield's architectural profile through momentary illumination, revealing not the dignified facade presented to daily observation, but the true contours of a structure designed for purposes beyond habitation. The copper weather vanes upon its roof, their decorative scroll work, concealing specialized conductivity elements, channel atmospheric electricity through the building's hidden circulatory system, temporarily energizing delivery mechanisms that remain dormant during conventional operation. On this particular evening, as thunderheads gathered above Millfield with meteorological precision, residents throughout the Thornfield experienced simultaneous alterations in their perceptual frameworks. Artists discovered their brush strokes following patterns they had not consciously selected. Writers found their narratives incorporating motifs that emerged not from imagination, but from some external architectural influence. Musicians perceived harmonic progressions that their training insisted were theoretically unsound yet aesthetically compelling beyond rational explanation. The raindrops that struck the building's exterior carried molecular compositions distinct from natural precipitation. Their chemical structure altered by industrial emissions from facilities operating in strict accordance with atmospheric research protocols established through institutional cooperation. These compounds, activated by electrical discharge, penetrated the Thornfield specialist masonry through microscopic channels engineered for optimal absorption and distribution. Beneath the ground floor lobby, in a chamber whose existence appears in no architectural drawing available to public examination, automated systems monitored these atmospheric conditions with scientific detachment. Gauges registered barometric fluctuations. Spectrographic analyzers measured compound concentrations. Data architecture recorded perceptual response patterns transmitted from sensors embedded throughout the building's residential units. The storm's intensity peaked at precisely 3 minutes past midnight when a lightning strike of exceptional voltage made direct contact with the primary weather vane. Electrical current propagated through the building's hidden conductive network, momentarily illuminating pathways concealed within walls and beneath floorboards. A circulatory system more complex than the human cardiovascular architecture it was designed to influence. In this moment of perfect conductivity, as electromagnetic energy temporarily altered the molecular distribution mechanisms throughout the structure, residents experienced simultaneous cognitive alignment. A brief interval of collective perception in which the carefully maintained boundaries between individual consciousness dissolved into architectural unity. For 17 seconds, each inhabitant perceived the Thornfield not as separate apartments housing discrete lives, but as integrated observational ecosystem, their individual experiences merely components in a system designed for aggregate analysis. What distinguished this particular storm from countless others that had struck the building throughout its operational history was not its intensity, but its timing. Occurring precisely 91 years after the Thornfield's initial activation, completing a cycle documented in research parameters established by its original designers. The data collected during this electromagnetic culmination would provide comparative metrics against baseline measurements established during previous generational transitions, allowing institutional assessment of perceptual evolution across nearly a century of continuous observation. As the final thunderclap reverberated through Millfield's rained streets, the Thornfield completed its most significant data collection sequence since initial implementation. The architectural experiment, having fulfilled its primary observational cycle, prepared for methodological evolution based on analytical conclusions derived from 91 years of patient documentation, transitioning not toward conclusion, but toward more sophisticated implementation of principles established through generational persistence. Dawn breaks with unsettling clarity over Millfield, the sun ascending behind the Thornfield silhouette with calculated precision, as though even celestial movements adhere to the building's methodical rhythm. The architectural profile stands darkly etched against the morning sky. Its weathered cornices and ornate facade no longer mere aesthetic elements, but components in a delivery system whose sophistication transcends conventional understanding. A solitary figure approaches along Hemlock Street. Her measured footsteps echoing across rain-washed cobblestones still glistening from the night's electrical storm. She carries a leather portfolio whose contents represent the culmination of research extending beyond individual lifespans. 91 years of perceptual documentation, chemical refinement, and architectural integration distilled into conclusions that will guide the Thornfield's next operational cycle. The lobby door yields to her touch with silent acquiescence as though the building itself acknowledges her authority. Within the marble flooring reflects amber illumination from gaslight-inspired fixtures whose chemical emissions have subtly altered countless perceptions over decades of patient administration. The brass elevator awaits, its cage door standing open in mechanical invitation. Upon reaching the ground floor office, she arranges documents upon the mahogany desk with meticulous precision. Lease agreements for incoming tenants rest beside architectural modifications scheduled for implementation over the coming months. Most significant lies a leather-bound journal containing handwritten observations spanning generations of property managers. Not supernatural documentation, but methodical record of perceptual manipulation refined through institutional persistence. The morning light strengthens, penetrating stained glass transoms to cast prismatic patterns across the office walls. These chromatic distortions represent not random beauty but calculated frequencies designed to enhance cognitive receptivity during tenant interviews. Each element of the Thornfield serves multiple functions. Aesthetic presentation concealing methodological implementation. Architectural beauty disguising institutional purpose. When prospective tenants arrive later today, they will perceive merely an atmospheric apartment building with historical character and reasonable rates. They will notice the peculiar clause regarding third-floor restrictions with curious interest rather than suspicion. They will attribute the building's distinctive ambience to architectural antiquity rather than environmental engineering. And when they take residence, their perceptions will gradually align with the Thornfield's methodical influence. Their creative endeavors unconsciously incorporating patterns distributed through specialized delivery systems. Their dreams reflecting architectural suggestions rather than personal subconscious. Their understanding of reality itself subtly altered through precisely calibrated compounds administered through walls that observe while they deliver. The Thornfield stands as testament not to supernatural presence but to institutional patience. Architecture designed to function beyond human limitation. Continuing its methodical documentation of perception with mechanical precision. Its weathered facade conceals not mystical threshold but philosophical proposition. That reality exists not as objective truth but as consensus maintained through perceptual agreement. As morning fully illuminates Millfield, the building settles into its daily rhythm. Ventilation systems distributing precisely calibrated compounds, structural elements transmitting specific frequencies. Every architectural detail fulfilling its designated purpose in a system designed to perpetuate itself beyond the lifespans of those who established its protocols or those who temporarily inhabit its carefully designed spaces. This has been the Ghastly Journal. Until next time, remember that some stories are best left untold.